Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus at your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to look at the wider subject of exactly how long have the globalists been in control of the British political establishment. Now, we can say today that their control is total. I mean, as an indication of how total, the globalists can install their own flunky boy as prime minister without a vote of the parliament, without a vote of the party, and without a vote of the people. They just install their boy as prime minister. I mean, if that doesn't add up to you've got total fucking control, I don't know what other example you could bring up. Another example is how all the former British prime ministers that are still living are shameless salesmen and spruikers and shilling and pushing the globalist project, how wonderful it is. Anyone that's against it is a Nazi, and the normal sort of globalist talking points. And they're doing this with great regularity, and given their alleged articles and speeches just so completely on message, that is globalist message, and clearly these things are being written for them, and they're just being wheeled out to try and add credibility and general support for the globalist project. Now, the fact that the globalists keep going back to these people, hey, you gotta, here's an article, we got to put your name on it. Those people that were protesting about globalization yesterday, you have to write an article saying that they're all Hitler. And then, needless to say, the globalist media runs with these stories and gives them a prominent place on their websites and their news announcements and so on. So clearly the globalist control of Britain is total. A couple of other examples, I guess, was that Liz, the very short-lived Prime Minister, Liz Truss, I believe that, she was embarking on a risky course of action, the Go for Growth thing, her surrounding herself with, black immigrants as ministers. I think that was a sop to the globalists. I'm not sure she would have done that if she hadn't been under sort of globalist pressure. But I think she wanted to chart a course that the globalists just didn't approve of. And she thought, well, I'm the prime minister, I'm in charge here. And the globalists went, oh, you think so? Yeah, we're fucking in charge, and don't you forget it. And the next day, she's not prime minister anymore. So the globalists have such control, they can get your in parliament, they can get your colleagues, your allegedly and supposedly elected representatives of the people, they can just get your colleagues to turn against you and throw you out, even though you're the elected leader. Now, at least Liz Truss had some credibility. She was, the grassroots of the party had elected her after a fairly lengthy exercise of where multiple candidates were putting their hands up. Now, I don't, I was quite surprised that because she behaves, in my view, like a first year uni student in the sociology department in the debating team or something. and so the idea of someone like that as prime minister of the once mighty United Kingdom struck me as almost comical. But I think Rishi Sunak's even worse. So and again, whether he's a better administrator or so, that he was simply appointed by the globalist cabal. I've got a real problem with that. There's anyone that believes in the sovereignty of sovereign nations and sovereign parliaments and sovereign political parties should, but it's simply an illustration of how non-sovereign the United Kingdom is. And you can see from a globalist perspective, given that Britain's really the cradle of modern industrial technical civilization, so it had to be targeted for eradication and destruction, just simply to eradicate white history and the history of how the world sort of was and how it developed organically and that sort of stuff. That had to be got rid of, and it's quite hard to do, or not easy to do, in a nation that's had such continuity in its political establishments and its customs and so on. Other nations have had much disruption to that continuity, Britain has had a particularly long continuity. Therefore, it's viciously targeted for destruction. America, similarly, simply because it's the biggest economy and it's if you like, the cultural sort of leader of much of the world. So that too has to be designated and targeted for destruction, which is why there is so much effort put into crushing the white British public and the American public. Anyway, I want to sort of go back to when did the globalists take over? Now, if you sort of go back and say the biographies and the histories of the prime ministers since World War II in Britain, so we're talking, Clement Attlee, Winston Churchill briefly, Anthony Eden briefly, Harold Macmillan, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, and then you get to sort of Margaret. Well, there were other short premierships, Sir Alec Douglas-Home and that sort of thing. But in terms of premierships that lasted any appreciable time, you then get to Margaret Thatcher. And now, if you look, say, Clement Attlee, you couldn't call Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister immediately after at the end of World War II, you couldn't describe him as a globalist. He's very much a nationalist. He had some internationalist type views. He was a leftist or a Labor politician. He had some internationalist views in terms of that dreamy, starry-eyed thing of workers of the world unite and create a socialist utopia. There's a bit of that in some of his stuff, but he's far too much of a realist and a patriot and a nationalist to go down that rabbit hole too far. So he was what you'd call today they'd attack him as being a far right Nazi, even though he was a leftist. But he was the one who was instituting the National Health Scheme and so on. And this was a generation that was deeply scarred by the scars of the First World War had never healed. Then there was the Great Depression. Then there was the Second World War. So there was a belief that the people had suffered enough and that they should have things like a national health scheme, particularly following a war where there was many people that were injured and maimed, and also things like widows' pensions and all sorts of things like that I think, in my view, are eminently sensible and quite reasonable. Now, they did other things like they nationalised industries that were monopoly industries, or in effect monopolies, things like railways and power generation. Their argument was that a monopoly shouldn't be in the hands of a private firm. There either had to be market competition or the government should own the monopoly. Now, one of the downsides of governments owning monopolies is that they when they want to bring unemployment numbers down, they simply stack like fuck. They stack these government-owned enterprises and they overman them in very Soviet-type style, where for every job that there's to do, you've got 10 people doing it. So the state-owned enterprises become these outrageous loss-making enterprises that are shot through with worker privilege committees and all sorts of crazy stuff that makes the enterprise just scream to be put back in private hands. But these were all patriots, these people. Even if you look at Harold Macmillan, who would be considered today far right, who was a conservative politician, but still, you look at his writings and his musings and the notations he made, which are all now released from the 35-year rule and so on of confidentiality, and all these people there are long dead. But Macmillan was very much of how can you deliver a higher standard of living to the people. And he told you that people have elected me. They've elected my government. I have a duty to do things for them. I report to the people. Now, he had a patrician's view of the hoi polloi, which you can imagine was dismissive, but the concept of public duty and public service and the duty of his government was clearly there. So still, you've got a nationalist and a patriot as the prime minister and the government. Now, Britain couldn't act as a completely independent sovereign nation at the time. They were very reliant on loans from the United States, that sort of thing. But to the extent they could represent the people, the government did. And Macmillan was interesting because he was fighting with the bigger firms and the private sector, and he was saying the only way you can guarantee a higher standard of living to the people is to ensure that market competition operates efficiently. You can't allow too much power in the hands of one organisation, because then they'll use that power to increase prices and screw the public and so on, or they'll give lower quality goods and they'll try and increase their profit because they don't run the risk of the consumer going down the road and buying something else. So it's very much the idea of consumer goods. But if you look at the inflation on real estate and property, there vast profits in real estate, just other than for, say, property developers, corrupt property developers, and getting land for free and kicking back money to politicians and so on. That aside, the rate of inflation on property was sort of the same rate of inflation just generally within the community, and so the purchasing power of the paycheck held pretty constant. You look at the sort of wages that were around at the time, and they're almost laughably low. But then you look at the prices. The loaf of bread was 9 cents, for example, even though pay may have only been a few $1,000s a year. But then when you multiply out the price of bread today to wages, then bread's 28% more expensive today than it was then in purchasing power terms. So the idea that Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had was that he didn't mind helping industry. He did, actually. I thought they were rather generous in the subsidies and the handouts, but he insisted in return they must be competitive, and that the only way to ensure that the public had a high standard of living was to really make sure that market competition was at play. That didn't mean they delivered it perfectly. Incidentally, there was a lopsided in some areas and quite good in others, but their commitment was there. Now you see the same again with the premierships of other, the prime ministerships of others following. They still had an idea of what could they do for the public. Now you started to see changes around the late 1960s, which is around the time that these think tanks, right-wing think tanks, were coming out with this. How do we create more consumers? We've got a lot of capital in the West, the Western world, as opposed to the communist bloc at the time, and we've got billions of penniless, subsistence, barter existing peasants. How do we start to get those two together to create more consumers, more workers? Also, how do we get more women into the workforce? Now, that's something that the political left were into. And they looked with some admiration at the Soviet Union, where technically at least everybody worked, everybody consumed. And they went into the Western economic thinkers and so on, went into a bit of a swoon at the time about how efficient that was. Everybody works, everybody consumes, and went all sort of... went into a swoon over that, as in they thought it represented possibilities for lower wages and, as they perceived it at the time, higher profits. I don't think that was a globalist gig. I think there were sympathies with things that would later become part of the globalist shtick, but I think that was incidental. Whether or not that was the genesis and nucleus of what later would become globalization, that I can accept, but I don't think they knew it at the time. Also, the idea of bringing out, black peasants into England. There were pronouncements at the time, say 1967, around there, 68, where politicians were coming out saying, well, how are we going to get people to work in the nursing home? Where are the nurses going to come from for our national health scheme? How are we going to get people to dig the ditches and clean the toilets? Local people don't want to do that, so therefore we have to import a special peasant class to do that work. Now, that should have set off alarm bells everywhere. Well, you're going to import a special peasant class to do that work? Don't we live in a market economy? If you can't find workers to do these manual labour jobs, catch rats in the sewers, if you can't find workers to do it, then you simply pay more. And you keep on raising the pay until people say, yep, I'm prepared to do that job. That's how a market economy, in a capitalist market economy, works. Now, if you can't make that work, then there's a problem somewhere else. You add more benefits into that role, but you do something to make that work attractive to people who otherwise may not want to do it, or hitherto were doing it and left for what they thought was a better job in some other sector. But instead, this idea of, well, no, we don't have to operate in a market economy. We've designated that job as a low-paid job, and therefore we will import peasants from the third world to do it. Then automatically you've failed. The corruption of the capitalist system is already, it's going to eat away at the capitalist system like a cancer, which indeed it did, and we even see that today. And if you look at any sort of you look at in Australia, for example, the list of so-called skills that the economy is short of, they're not fucking skills at all. They're dishwashers, people to paint nails in beautician salons, and so on. And they get rural peasants out of China and India and take out food shops and so on. The peasants and then they bring them out here to be horribly exploited, and then the taxpayer is exploited as well, because all these salaries and pays and everything are packaged up with accommodation, food, and so on. So no one's paying any fucking tax, and a special peasant serf labour class is being imported, which in a capitalist economy shouldn't be occurring. Anybody's wage should be responsive, and any business should be responsive to market forces. Now, the argument on the other side is, well, look, if these takeout food shops have to pay full market rates for workers, then we're not going to see any takeout food shops. Well, fine. Then there's another way of handling this. Then look for another way, but don't create a fucking peasant class, and particularly don't bypass market economics just because you think that's the way it should be or must be in some bullshit fucking alternative universe. So anyway, going along here, you see that the gradual erosion of commitment to not simply market economics, because definitely that is erosion of that, but the idea of, and this is very gradual, the idea of getting peasant workers to come as a peasant class. Now, the numbers weren't great at the time, but they were a small percentage of the population, I guess, 1, 2, 3% in total, if that. And some of these people, especially say nurses from the Caribbean islands, they would come to Britain for their training. They would stay for a few years, get the practical experience, and then they would go back to the Caribbean or Africa, for example, and were, to a large extent, were encouraged to do so because they could get quite prestigious jobs back in their home countries, given their Western qualifications and their expertise that they'd acquired while training and studying in Britain in this case. So then we come to the Margaret Thatcher. There's a little bit of a hiatus in there, I think, but just before Thatcher. But then we get to Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister for 10 years, slightly longer, but Thatcher was very clearly a patriot, very clearly believed in market economics, and did much struggle and battle with the unions. So I didn't agree. I thought she was too heavy-handed on that, but nonetheless, and believed in not only reducing union power, which did need to be reduced, it was being abused and horribly infiltrated by the Soviet Union agitators, and people that were starry-eyed about a Marxist paradise was only around the corner. But this idea of being a patriot and being committed to the British people and responsible to them was something that Thatcher she wasn't a globalist stooge. She still believed that she was elected by the people and represented them. Now, she believed there were a large group of people who, maybe not a majority in the electorate, who were opposed to her views and saw her economics as radical. I didn't think it was handled very well, and there were some challenges because they were finding oil in the North Sea, which meant the British pound was revalued, to a higher level. I think it was really justified, which made their exports expensive and imports relatively less expensive, and that created distortion effects on the economy. There was all that stuff that she had to deal with, but eventually she created an environment in Britain that was very favourable to capital. So international capital moved in. I don't know whether Thatcher saw this, but when the international capital came in and very much set up shop in London, more so than ever had been, then other than in the heady days of empire. But then I don't think Thatcher realised that this would change the power structure in Britain and move the power away from the body politic to the financial sector. And I don't think Thatcher necessarily saw that. She saw that the financial sector coming in would provide tax revenues, it would provide well-paid jobs, it would do all those sorts of things which were good for the economy, which they were, by the way. But the change in the power structure, I'm not sure Thatcher really saw that. So in the end, if you look at her policies, some were quite favourable to globalisation, whether they be indirectly favourable or that she actually believed this was the right thing to do and just happened to be, that happened to coincide with some of the globalist stuff. But she still believed, hey, I'm in charge here and I represent the English people or the British people. So, I'm the boss when it comes to the final decisions, Thatcher thought. And I think it reached a stage where the globalists said, well, no, you're not the boss. Actually, we are. We decide now. You may have been when you first came to number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, but you sure as hell ain't anymore. And again, the globalists were getting some of what they wanted, but they weren't getting all of what they wanted. And really, it was I think it was an issue of who's in charge here. Us or them. Is it me as Prime Minister and the cabinet of the United Kingdom, the government, or is it the globalists? Now, given that the communist bloc was tottering and ready to sort of keel over, this I think emboldened the globalists. And Thatcher with Reagan had kind of played a role, I guess, in making life hard for the Soviets, who were already in trouble economically anyway. I think Reagan got far too much credit for that. They were already struggling. Now, Thatcher, it got to the point where it was a showdown of who's in charge. I think it was necessarily about globalist policies, although that would have fed into it. But it came down to who's in charge. And Thatcher said, well, I'm in charge. And the globalists said, no, you're not. We are. And that was it. And Thatcher having Prime Minister 10 years with a number of achievements to her credit, but still the globalists were able to get all her colleagues to turn on her and throw her out. And as we see today, an arch globalist, John Major, supporting all the globalist initiatives, all the talking points, spouts the talking points. He was then installed as Prime Minister and began to implement what today we would see as the globalist project and to undo some of the Thatcher initiatives that would have been impediments to the globalist project. So I would say 1990, when Thatcher got kicked out by her own colleagues, I would say that was when the globalists took control in Britain. Now, they went softly at first, and the media that they did, it went the reverse. In the US, they sort of got the media first, but in the United Kingdom, there was still a lot of the media that was not on board with the globalist project. And I remember reading papers as a young guy, reading newspapers and listening to the TV, news broadcast when I was over there. That was very much against mass migration, against feminism, against teaching Marxism in schools and all the things. There's a lot of pushback against that, but now you see none, which shows you just how far the globalist project has taken over all the organs and institutions in the United Kingdom. In 1990, it wasn't so. You didn't really see it to anywhere near the extent you see it now. Now the BBC was starting to get on board with the globalist project, but not to the, again, nowhere near the extent you are today. So I would say that certainly from 1990 onwards, and at the apex of the British political establishment, that the globalists have been in charge, and their power and control has tightened and increased since then, to the point now where they control everything in the United Kingdom. It's nothing more than some sort of globalist controlled basket case. You've been a Tacitus today. You're a pushback channel. Thank you for listening.